I love how Zoom has the voice that lets you know that now. All right. So, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for being here this evening. My name is Edward. I am president of Chicago Ornithological Society, and welcome to this latest episode of Birds and Bytes, our virtual program series. So, first things first, as mentioned, we are recording this program, so please keep yourselves muted. If you don't want to be on camera, go ahead and turn your camera off. I will be coming through here with the mute hammer. We don't want to have somebody, I don't know, having a random conversation or doing the dishes in the background of the program, which has happened on a previous program. So let's not have that. Additionally, if you have, if you're interested in any of the other future programs that we're doing or previous recordings, we have recordings of our previous Birds and Bytes program on our YouTube channel. And we also have a number of upcoming Birds and Bytes programs that are also already scheduled on our website. So if you want to head over to chicagobirder.org, that's our website, you can learn more about future programs and future bird hikes and walks as well. On that note, while I'm directing you guys to our website, if you are not already a member of COS, why the heck not? Becoming a member is about as cheap as basically a dinner out for a year, and that goes into supporting awesome programs like this one for free, open to the public, as well as a number of different conservation initiatives that we take upon across the Chicagoland area. Speaking of conservation, I'm going to break with my normal pre-programmed script here to also bring you guys a quick update. If you guys have been paying attention any at all to the news lately, there is a certain prairie called Bell Bowl Prairie that is on the chopping block, was about to get bulldozed on Monday. COS has been a supporter of not having it bulldozed, and we've been fighting for this rare site with numerous endangered species living there. And we got news this afternoon that the construction has been halted. The airport is scrapping its plans and will be redesigning the plans. So woo, 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 hooray for preventing endangered species from being bulldozed. Sorry, I just had to get that in there. Because obviously, while we're on the topic of, species that are threatened and at some point potentially lost, I think it's important to know that even as we look at extinctions and dissect where we went wrong, we need to look at that and go, hey, but there are still things today that we can do, meaningful things that we can do today to, protect the species that we have left with us. So I'm going to get off my soapbox here. You guys didn't come here to listen to me talk. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Burgio of the New York City Audubon, who has been gracious enough to join us and share his expertise with us this evening. So I will go ahead and turn it over to you, Kevin. Everybody give him a warm round of virtual applause here.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Yeah, so just before I get started, I would like to say this is not a formal presentation by any means. If you do have any questions, please feel free to interrupt me and ask, or you could save it to the end. Either way is fine with me.
Let's maybe have people put their questions in the chat.
Sure.
So then either Kevin, you can answer them directly, or if folks want to you can invite folks to unmute to ask it themselves, make things a little bit more personal.
Sure.
Yeah,
that's cool. All right, so let me share my screen and see if I can get it right this time. We good? Do you just see the slide? Yes. Okay.
Looks good.
Great. So yeah, here's we're going to be talking about Carolina parakeets today. Obviously, that's why you're here. And there's all my credentials and everything. I usually like to start my talks with. Wait, no. Oh, I'm sorry. I have 3 screens, so this is. Did that advance, or?
It is not advanced.
Oh, for God's sake! Now?
Yes.
Okay. Whew. All right. I just had to figure out which button to advance. So I usually like to start by thanking all the people that gave me money to do the research. Without them, none of this would have been possible, obviously. And all my co-authors that have helped me with all this work. I've been studying this species for about 10 years now, which looking back on it seems like a really long time, especially for something that's no longer around. So just to give you a background in why I study extinct parrots, or just parrots in general, which may seem weird because I get my dissertation in the University of Connecticut, where we do not have any native parrots. We do have monk parakeets, which I'm sure you're all familiar with out in the Chicago area. But I was starting from a very young age. I had a parrot. This is Mojo. And Mojo was a Timna Gray. And he was actually kind of a bastard to everybody. He and he escaped his cage one time. And I lived in northeastern Connecticut, and this was like in October. And he managed to live almost a week outside before I lured him in with some French fries. And it really was remarkable to me that this bird that's from Africa, that lives in a very hot place, was able to survive in the winter, or at least the fall in Connecticut, because it was quite cold that fall. And that I think that's stuck in the back of my mind, because whereas I didn't go to school right after, I didn't go to college right after high school. I joined the military, and I was in for 6 years. And then I worked in a dental office for 3 years in a public health clinic before finally going to college. But throughout, I was still always into parrots in one form or another. And, going back to monk parakeets, I did my undergrad research on monk parakeets because I was unaware that they lived in Connecticut or anywhere else, until one day I was down on the coast of Connecticut and I saw a bunch of them. And I thought, the first thought I had was like, oh man, someone just lost all their parrots. Like they're probably pretty upset. And I'm like, then, but who has a flock of like 10 of the same species? That's wild. And just seeing these birds like in the winter, as you know, it just seems, it's like cognitive dissonance, right? You have this like species that looks like it belongs on the equator, just hanging out in the snow. And that really fascinated me. And it really led me into start thinking about Carolina parakeets, because when I was doing my undergraduate research on monk parakeets, people were coming up to me and saying, all the controversy about whether or not we should get rid of monk parakeets and all. And people are saying, well, we shouldn't get rid of them because they are taking up the niche left by the Carolina parakeet. So they should be here because we killed off the Carolina parakeet, and now these parrots are taking their place. Which after doing like a research paper for a class on the subject, trying to look at the similarities and differences. And if any of you own parrots or have been around parrots, you know that no two species are alike. They're all very different. And just because they both are able to live in colder environments than one would expect a parrot, doesn't necessarily mean that they are actually fulfilling the same role. And in fact, if you look at the distribution of Carolina parakeets, their historic distribution, which we'll get to shortly, and their distribution in the monk parakeets distributions, they're almost negative to one another. Because the Carolina parakeet was mostly a species of the woods, in the forests and the swamps, whereas the monk parakeet is a species of the kind of like the grasslands and shrubby areas. So I largely realized that they probably weren't a good proxy for the Carolina parakeet, but I got really interested in the Carolina parakeet. And what really hooked me in was this one story that I'll tell you that's just fascinating about the Carolina parakeet. I started reading more about them. And one of their most famous sightings of the Carolina parakeet was in this town called Shahari up in upstate New York. So in the winter of 1779, it was during the, sorry, my cats are going wild for some reason. During the winter of 1779, during the Revolutionary War, up in this town, up in upstate New York, it was a farming area where they grew wheat, and they were using that wheat to feed the American Revolutionary Army. And the people who lived there were very religious people who had come from Germany. They were called Palatines. And one day in December of 1779, a flock of Carolina parakeets flew in, landed on someone's house. Now, we would be, if we saw that, we'd be like, oh my God, that's amazing. But these people, being very superstitious, I guess, immediately thought that they were harbingers of the end times. So you have these Carolina parakeets that were probably further north than normal, just trying to, it was probably a hard winter. They were trying to find some nuts. And suddenly they're being cast in the role of, the fifth horseman of the apocalypse. And they were seriously alarmed at this. So what happened was, nothing happened. The world didn't end right away, obviously. But the next year in 1780, in the fall, right when they were getting ready to go out and get all the crops and bring them in, the British, with some Native American troops, came down from Canada and just started burning all the crops. So that would affect the Revolutionary troops. So this was Sir John Johnson and the King's Royal Regiment of New York swooped down from Canada and set everything on fire. So the people of this town now had it in the back of their head that the apocalypse is coming. They look around and everything's on fire. There's cannons going off, and they were like, this is it. This is what we were waiting for. This is the end times. They all crowded in this church here. And the first house that the British burnt down was the house that the birds actually landed on. So they saw that as a sign. And interestingly enough, this church that they all crowded in still exists to this day and still has a cannonball from that day. You could see the hole right there in the upper right hand picture, and the actual cannonball is still there. So afterwards, George Washington reported to the Continental Congress that, times are really tough because the British came down and destroyed all their crops and everything. And that's the tie into the Carolina parakeet. So that story just fascinated me. And it really got me interested in learning more about the species. So to get into some of the biology of this species, as I mentioned before, they were a species of they're really a species of the forests in the swamps. So in the southeastern part of their range, they were predominantly found in impenetrable swamps, and in the kind of the area, up in like Illinois and Nebraska, they were found in hardwood bottomland forest, especially around rivers. And so there's two subspecies of the Carolina parakeet. There's the carolinensis and there's the ludovicianus. And the carolinensis is the southeastern subspecies, and the ludovicianus would be the ones that were up in your neck of the woods up in Illinois. And in the northwestern part of their range. So back in 1891, most ornithologists at the time realized that they were pretty much on their way out. So this gentleman here created a range map that he thought was their historical range. So if you look at this heavy black mark around can you see my cursor now? No? Yes.
A little bit, yeah.
Oh, okay. So if you look at this heavy black line here, this is where he thought their historical range of the Carolina parakeet was. And the heavy black dots here are where they were as of 1890. And the interesting thing about this map is, like a lot of things, they didn't have a very sophisticated way of doing things, not like we do now. But if you could see here, the author thought they had a very healthy respect for state boundaries. where the birds apparently never crossed into New Jersey, which, now that I work in New York, I could probably see why. And, just kind of straddled the border of Massachusetts and Connecticut, but never really going in there. But in looking at this map, I'm like, well, I don't know. That doesn't seem very accurate to me. That sighting I just talked about in Shahari, well, that was the only time they've ever really been seen up in upstate New York. And as we know, there's often eruption years. There's often birds that just show up where they don't usually belong. And could it be that some of the outside part of this range is artificially extended because they just took a marker and drew a circle around all the most distant observations people had reported? And to try to give you a little bit more about the subspecies here, the eastern subspecies is on the eastern side of the Appalachian Mountains, and the western subspecies here is on the left, on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains, on the western side. But like looking at this map, it started making me wonder, especially because Carolina parakeets were of parrot species that have gone extinct are an order of magnitude in range size than any other extinct parrot. And it just seemed like really wild to me that such a far-ranging parrot would go extinct in evolutionary terms in the blink of an eye. And in about 100 years, they went from being, as Audubon put it, their population around 1800 was pretty stable. And after that, that's when he started noticing the decline. And by 1890, they're pretty much gone and just relegated to these really small pockets of these like remnant populations. So it made me think about their range and if it was really that big or not. Another thing that really that I really started thinking about is, do they undergo seasonal movements? Like the red-headed woodpecker actually has a very similar range to the Carolina parakeet, but they shift. They have a seasonal movement to the southwesterly in the depths of the winter because I lived in Nebraska for a few years when I was in the Air Force, and it gets really cold there. So if I were a parrot, I would want to leave. So, but there's, and people had in the literature, people had talked about it, but never actually tested to see if it was true or not. And of course, the big question I get when I talk to anybody about Carolina parakeets is, when did they go extinct and how did they go extinct? I mean, those are the two things people care about. And sadly, those are actually the two hardest questions to answer, especially how did they go extinct? Because we have there's dates where people say, oh, they were extinct in 1920 or 1911. And, even though there were credible sightings up into the late 1930s. And without knowing some of these other information, some of these questions that I asked, it's hard to actually get to how they went extinct. And we could talk about we'll talk about how they went extinct later on. But these are the big questions I had when I was starting to think about this and starting my PhD dissertation work. So in order to test any of these things, I need to collect data. But how do you collect data about a species that went extinct, 80 to 100 years ago? Well, the only thing I could do is read books and try to figure out where people had seen Carolina parakeets so that I can use some of our modern, more sophisticated tools and statistical approaches to try to see if I could get data from all of these different sources. And on the screen here, this is Lewis and Clark. And I was reading their about their journey in their writing where they spotted sorry about my cats. I don't know if you can hear them, but they're tearing around my house. They reported seeing Carolina parakeets right outside this Native American village in Homer, Nebraska. And I was thinking about it and I was like, wow, I bet you I could figure out where that village was based on, what they wrote about and any other information about this tribe and where they had these settlements. And I was actually able to use this program here, which is called Geolocate, which is used to identify where specimens, where like people shot birds or collected plants or whatever, used to get the geographic coordinates for these specimens. But I decided that I could also use them for these, like just these observations. And I found that I was able to identify the exact area where that settlement was. And I could also calculate how much uncertainty there is in the exact location of where the bird was seen. Because as you can imagine, they could say that they were at the settlement. Well, we can only get so accurate of information. So the sighting could be anywhere in this circle here. So I was able to get coordinates, and I was able to calculate the amount of uncertainty with that, which is really important when we're doing these kind of statistical modeling approaches. So spending a long time reading countless accounts, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of accounts of Carolina parakeets, observations, and going through all of the specimens that are located in natural history museums that had enough data where I could actually figure out the geographic coordinates of these observations and the specimens. I actually ended up with over 850 observations of Carolina parakeets that had good data that I could actually use in these modeling approaches. And so I was, it took me, it was actually the favorite part of my dissertation was just reading all these historical accounts about where people saw Carolina parakeets. Some of the places are ghost towns now. Some of them are areas that are just, are widely inaccessible and no longer habitated. And some of them are in like towns like Tampa Bay, but Tampa Bay in like the 1880s is much different than the Tampa Bay of today. So I get to learn a lot about the exploration and the spread of, the colonies in across the U.S. And it was just fascinating experience to just learn all this information. And the thing that you probably readily note about this is it looks like a lot of these sightings are along major rivers. You have the Wabash up here on your eastern border, and then you have the Ohio, then you have the Mississippi. And one of the reasons why was these birds were predominantly found around water, but it was also the people who wrote about exploring where people were explorers, and they had their diaries, and they traveled a lot on these rivers. So the data set might be skewed a bit, like kind of biased towards rivers or right next to rivers. But in reading a lot about other accounts of Carolina parakeets, I determined that the bias probably wasn't terrible, because there's accounts of people traveling through the Appalachian Mountains and never hearing a single Carolina parakeet until they got close to water. So I wasn't too concerned about that kind of bias in my data set going forward. However, in modeling, there's a lot of different things you have to do in order to make sure your data is really good, in that you're not like unnecessarily getting a lot of an overestimation of a preference for a place just because a bunch of them were shot in the same day in the same place. So I had to thin the data. And so I actually ended up removing any observations like the ones up in New York here, any observations that were either questionable or they've only been seen in that area like once and nowhere anywhere near them, like kind of these like just like vagrants. And so by doing that, I took a data set that took me probably a year to collect, of 861 sightings to 150, give or take, which was very painful to do, honestly. So what I wanted to do is try to figure out what was their actual range. And then to do that, there's an approach that conservation biologists and ecologists use called distribution modeling, where you basically try to find where the species was and where it wasn't. And you basically just say, okay, well, the species is found, predominantly in these areas with this set of climate conditions, this set of habitats. And you feed that information into a model, and it identifies, based on areas that you haven't seen any, the likelihood that that species is probably there based on the conditions. That's a very oversimplified way to talk about distribution modeling, but that's it in a nutshell. So what I did was I collected the oldest possible climate data I could find here, going back to the 1890s. The data is actually really quite remarkable for being so old. And so this is just the annual temperature. This is just a representation of what the annual temperature is at all these different spots. And so I use that information, the sightings the observations and the climate data, and I produced this following map here, this map right here, that looks at, the conditions in all of this entire area, uses the information where the birds were to give you the likelihood of the species occurring there. So as you can see, this is much smaller, because I have the outline of that 1891 map here, an approximation of it. And I also modeled the two subspecies independently. And you could see here that their range was much smaller than originally considered. And sorry, what's up? Get out of here. And so the Western subspecies, you can see here, did have quite a large range, and extending just up to Chicago. And the southeasterly did really stay along the coast here. And that's really backed up by the observations and all of the accounts that I read, that the birds were never really found in the mountains. You could see that the Ozarks out here are also kind of, there's like a donut around them. Another thing that I was interested in was, as I said before, was looking at whether or not their range shift in the winter. So I partitioned the data, and I found that doing this, looking at the differences between the model for the summer and for the winter, I found that the Western subspecies did in fact shift their range. Their breeding range was went up to up there into Chicago and over to the kind of where Omaha is, and down to Oklahoma. And in the winter, they shifted their range to southeasterly, where it was a little bit warmer. And the numbers down there, the D equals 0.678 is which is called Shiner's D, which is a measure of overlap, basically, with 1 being perfect overlap and 0 being no overlap. So there is 0.6, which is, for you stats people in the audience, is a significant finding. So it was different in the summer, in the winter. And unsurprisingly, the southeast one, there was no real difference between their breeding and their winter habitat. In fact, it almost completely overlapped, which makes a lot of sense. So now we found that the Carolina parakeet had a smaller range than previously believed, which makes their extinction make a little bit more sense, because they're, in general, the reason that makes sense is that species with larger ranges, usually it's a lot harder for them to go extinct than species with smaller ranges. And the reason for that is smaller ranges are much more susceptible to random events, like, a catastrophic disease breakout in a small spot, or a terrible storm comes and wipes out all the habitat, or something like that. And when you have a broadly distributed species, those like localized things don't really have a huge effect on the overall population. So now we're going to talk about how they went extinct and when. So there's a lot of different explanations, and people seem to think whenever I talk to them that we know exactly why they went extinct. Some people think it's because we hunted them to death. Some people say it was because we destroyed all their habitat. There's a number of different ways, but I mean, the answer is likely all of it, you know. So, you know, here we see the birds they're very colorful and beautiful birds. And they were very frequently used in the millinery trade and this woman actually has an entire Carolina parakeet on her hat, which is quite remarkable of a statement there. And another bird, I don't know what species that is underneath. I've tried to figure it out. I don't know. It looks kind of like a grouse or something. Maybe it's a heath hen, the other species that went extinct. That would make it a really remarkable hat, I guess. But you know, so people did shoot them for their feathers. People did collect them for the pet trade. So this is one of the 2 existing photos of living Carolina parakeets. This one's name is Doodles. It was this guy's pet. And we have this is the only other photo of a live Carolina parakeet that I'm aware of anyway. And this picture is really interesting because the bird is sitting here on a cocklebur, and which they like to eat the seeds of the cocklebur. And so they had this complicated relationship with farmers. So you might be aware of the really kind of graphic story that John James Audubon wrote about, where he was sitting with a farmer who had an orchard, and the farmer started shooting Carolina parakeets because they were eating his apples. And because they're a social species, when they cried out, more would come in to investigate what was going on. And so he just kept shooting them until he got tired of shooting them, essentially. So, you know, I don't know how many he shot. And Audubon was known to kind of exaggerate as well. So it may not have been as bad as he made it out to be, but regardless, farmers did shoot them because they did eat their fruit crops, especially the apple seeds. And the thing that apparently really made farmers dislike them is because they would not really eat much of the flesh of the apples. They would actually just dig through it for the seeds and then drop the apples on the ground, partially eaten, which, you know, I assume was pretty annoying for them. But some farmers did love them because they would eat the seeds of these nuisance plants and weeds. And the last, wait, I think there's one more. One of the other major explanations could be from disease. The picture I have, the reason I have like an old timey drawing of chickens here is because parrots are notoriously susceptible to disease. And, you know, as Europeans brought in their livestock, their domesticated chickens and ducks and geese, you know, while the Carolina parakeets were around these farms, they likely came into close contact with these other birds. And if they had diseases from Europe, that, you know, Carolina, much like the native peoples here, were very susceptible to European diseases because they didn't evolve to deal with them. It's possible that disease played a big role, but the thing about it is there's no direct evidence that any birds had disease. There's anecdotal observations of them suffering from what people called apoplexy, which is seizures. But certainly not like a large pattern enough to really point to it and say that's it. So last one that one of the big ones people talk about is habitat loss. And what I'm about to show you is kind of like a time series of agricultural development in our country. So if you look at 1810, up here in New England, you have some really intensive agriculture starting over here in Delaware. And then by 1850, you could see here like the Connecticut River Valley, the Hudson River Valley, and spreading out here around Chicago into the Midwest. And this is kind of in concert when the bird was starting serious declines. And then you could see by 1900, agriculture is intense, pretty much everywhere, except down in Florida. And, by 1930, it's just kind of, is just all over the place. So the Carolina parakeet, as I noted, was relegated to these really small populations by the 1890s. And looking at the last sightings, you have sightings into the 1920s in the Kissimmee Prairie, right near where Disneyland is today, or Disney World, sorry, is today. And into the late 1920s there. And in the Lower Santee River in South Carolina, you had really credible sightings up until 1938. So to try to figure out when they went extinct, I used this approach called extinction date estimating models. It's a really fancy way of trying to figure out when a species went extinct. And pretty much the way these models work is that if you imagine you have a species that's seen every single year for 100 years, and then suddenly you don't see it, and then you never see it again. Well, it's extremely likely that the last one that was reported was probably the last one or one of the last ones, because it's been seen consistently, as opposed to a species that's maybe really cryptic or one that's really hard to find, or one that people aren't really looking for. So you only see that species, there's only reports of it maybe once every 50 years. So, you see one, and then you see one 50 years later, and then you're like, well, what's the odds that that was the last one? Well, the odds are probably pretty slim, just because it's gone in the past long times without people seeing it. So that's how these models more or less work. And in this particular type of model that I used, gives different weight to different types of observations. So you have a specimen where you have a dead bird with a date on it. So you're very sure that the bird was there at that time because you have physical proof. And then you have like credible observations. Back then, there were no other parrots flapping around. So it was extremely likely if somebody reported one, it was likely a Carolina parakeet, especially if they have a description. And then there's controversial sightings, which are pretty rare up until the 1900s. And the reason why some of the more recent records are controversial is because a lot of these sightings were made by egg hunters back in the around 1900 and before. A popular hobby was collecting bird eggs, and the rarer the species, the more valuable the egg. So some of these egg hunters, especially down in Florida, would pass off eggs, potentially of the Carolina parakeet, potentially of something else that had similar color and shape eggs as a Carolina parakeet to make money. So there are some of these eggs in collections, but the collections have not allowed any kind of DNA testing of the eggs because it would be destructive. Or, maybe between us, perhaps they just don't want to know if they're real or not. And they could just pass it off as they're real. But anyway, you could assign different levels of certainty in these type of models. So here's the sighting record for the Western subspecies here. You can see it's very full. In this case, with these models, I always took the best available data per year. And so there's the sighting record there, not a lot of gaps. And then the eastern subspecies, you see lots of gaps, and then you get to about, say 1860s, 1865, and then you have all a bunch of specimens. And the reason for that is this is a lot to do with Florida here in like the 1890s, 1880s and 1890s, because ornithologists at the time knew that these birds were going out the door. So they all wanted to make sure that they had specimens in their collections. So you saw a lot of ornithologists going down to Florida, where they were at that point, the only reliable place to find them, and would collect them they would shoot them and collect them for their collections. And that's why we have, I think there's roughly 700 or so Carolina Parakeet specimens in different collections around the world. Most of them were probably collected between 1880 and 1900, which certainly didn't help. So throwing all this information into this model, you see here on the bottom, you have this graph here, and what you're looking at here on the bottom axis is the year. And then on this axis here, you have the likelihood of extinction, that year is the extinction date. So for the western subspecies, the one with the larger range, you have a likely extinction date somewhere around like 1915 or so, and 1914, 1915. And then you have the eastern subspecies here in this kind of this pink color here, likely in like 1945 or so. And then when I took all the records together and didn't separate them out by just subspecies here, you see that it's likely that if you just took them as a species as a whole, given all that data, was likely around like 1940 or the late 1930s. So the interesting thing I found about this is that even though the western subspecies had a much larger range, they went extinct probably about 30 years or so before the eastern subspecies. And that's a pretty big difference, and which is a clue, potentially a clue to their extinction process, which we will get to right now. So now we have a good idea of when the species went extinct and the differences between the two subspecies. We wanted to start looking at how did they go extinct? Because that's the big question. Like, if we're going to learn anything from the extinction of this species, we have to know why, what happened to them, because it's easy to say, well, the Europeans came over, and as you see, the Europeans spread westward along, as they, turned everything into farms in the Midwest, everything. And that's, at the time that was happening, you see European settlers going out, and then you see the population of the Carolina parakeets going down. And it would be really easy to say, well, look, there's clearly a connection there, and there certainly is. But what exactly was driving that extinction? Because if you think about all the areas that most parrots live today, it's all around the equator in a lot of countries that are now experiencing a similar kind of industrial and economic expansion that we were going through, our country was going through in the 1800s, where you're seeing a lot of forests being, cut down in order for more agriculture. And, so it would be really good to know what we did here to cause these extinctions, so that we could take those lessons and apply them to areas in the world where parrots are at peril, because parrots in general are one of the most at-risk groups of birds, where at least 46% of species or 43% of species are threatened or worse, according to the IUCN. So parrots in general are in trouble. And if we can learn something from this, but we really need to know why. So the next thing we did was we created this new approach called spatial extinction date estimation, which is essentially where we use the same approach that I just described in getting extinction dates and try to make it spatial, put it on a map. So we created this approach, and we try to publish it. It's still not published yet. I guess we're still kind of working on it. And we came up with this map. So this map is not good at illustrating like kind of the patterns you see, because it just looks like a bunch of colors. But on this map here, you see like the red ones, as you go from red to blue, the red ones are the earlier extinction dates, and the blue are the later extinction dates. But I animated this to make it a little bit more easy to see the patterns you'll see here. So as you see, the Western subspecies starts going from east to west and down, and then the Eastern subspecies really doesn't start shifting until the Western subspecies is almost gone, as you can see that. So that's really interesting. You know, you would expect, because of it was counterintuitive to me. I didn't expect to see this. So if you recall and say, oh, like, well, maybe the model's wrong, that just seems weird. So what I did is I took the model results and I graphed them over this prediction of where the species was in 1891. And so I superimposed, I digitized that. And so you see these kind of black outlines here with the gray. So this is where that map predicted or said that the Carolina parakeets were as of 1890. So I took the model results for 1890 and plotted them here. So the blue is the Western subspecies and the green is the Eastern subspecies. And these little X's you see here are actual sightings of Carolina parakeets after 1890. So it actually appears that my model was actually better at predicting where the species was at that time than this person's kind of anecdotal take a Sharpie to a map approach. So it made me feel confident that the model was accurate, or as accurate as a model can get, given the data. So using this approach, we looked at because of this range contraction that we saw, we used the climate, the agricultural data that we had, and we actually found that habitat loss didn't appear to be a major factor. The areas that the birds disappeared didn't really change all that much before and after they were no longer there. So it doesn't appear, I'm sure it was a factor, but trying to figure out like what was the major driver of this extinction, it doesn't appear, at least according to our models, that it was habitat loss. You know, and another interesting thing that I pointed out was that the Western subspecies, which was like kind of wiped out before the Eastern subspecies. And so we wanted to take a look at that. And so what we did was we looked at, you know, assuming that in like 1810, we had their full range, just looking at over time. So you have the blue line here is the Western subspecies. And this is just percentage of the range that was intact. And you can see here a very kind of linear decline here from starting about 1825. And then by 1880, you know, you're pretty much gone. And interestingly for you, you all out there in Illinois, that the Illinois River Valley was one of the 1880, they were still hanging on there, and then they kind of disappeared. So they, in another interesting anecdote, especially about Chicago, is there were 2 Carolina parakeets sighted in Chicago in 1912, but it's largely considered that they were escapee pets, and they weren't actually wild Carolina parakeets. You may already know that. Anyway, so the Eastern subspecies, you could see had a much kind of more I don't know what the word I'm looking for here, but dramatic, kind of like almost like, by 1885, you see a little decline, and then suddenly, boom, 1885 to 1900, they lost something like, I don't know, looks like 60% of their range. And so what we did was we looked at the velocity of range loss. And so basically per year, how much space were they losing? How much of their range were they losing? And you could see here up at the height around the 1860s, around the Civil War, the Western subspecies was losing 40,000 square kilometers a year of range. I mean, that is a gigantic amount of land. That's just huge. And you see here the Eastern subspecies, you see they have a really big spike starting in like 1890 of range loss, and then it just like boom, they're they spike there and just kind of go down until they have nothing left, essentially. So now this isn't like definitive, it's not, but the velocity of the range contraction leads me to believe that it had to be, or not had, it was much more likely disease than anything else. Because for hunting, if hunting was the main cause of this, to lose 40,000 square kilometers a year, you would have to have an army of people out there hosing them down, which we didn't see. I mean, there's certainly a lot of people out there shooting them, but it just doesn't feel to me that that was kind of the thing that was largely driving their extinction. I mean, it could have been, but the model doesn't really, I mean, in just looking at how they were like fine in 1800 and basically gone by 1890, that's just really fast. And one of my ideas, and it's probably impossible to verify any of this now, because studying something that went extinct 80 years ago is just hard. And there's not a lot of information that you can still gather. But the Western subspecies, in going extinct before the Eastern subspecies, one of my ideas of why that might be is the Western subspecies did not have regular access to salt like the Southeastern subspecies, where they lived right by the ocean. And Carolina parakeets were known to congregate at salt licks, and like in the hundreds, they would congregate there. So if potentially, like conjunctivitis at bird feeders with finches, it's possible that some sort of introduced disease got into the population. The birds came together at these salt licks, and the disease spread from there. And as the individuals would go back to where they usually hung out, and then would spread it to all of the rest of the birds in that area. Again, I don't think there's going to be a way to actually verify that that's true or not, but the logic in my mind at least points in that direction. But we don't have any smoking guns. And there was in my little caveat there at the bottom, is there was a paper published probably about a year and a half ago, where some researchers tried to recreate the genome of the Carolina parakeet, and somehow came to the conclusion that it wasn't disease that killed them, even though they only looked at one bird. They don't know where the bird came from or when it was collected, but yet they seem to think that they have it figured out, which I strongly disagree with. But anyway, so that's what we know about the Carolina parakeet. And I'll be happy to take any of your questions now.
Okay, so first of all, thank you all so much, Kevin. A lot to digest there. A quick round of applause here for Kevin. So yeah, if you guys have questions, why don't you go ahead and put them in the chat box, or at least just kind of raise your hand, and then we can kind of call on you to ask your question in person. I'll point out, I don't know if this is a good thing or a bad thing, right? But COS was founded in 1912. So right as our last Carolina Parakeet sighting. So read into that what you will here, guys. I guess we'll go ahead and start with the question that I know I had coming into this program. Um, just were they abundant, right? They had a range that they were within, but like many birds we have today, they could have a huge range, but within that range be pretty sparse. Were these birds
Yeah,
abundant? Were they sparse? Like, what was that like?
they were. I think it's really hard to say because the birds were not. They kind of moved around a lot. So, you know, it's really hard to say if they were abundant or they just had wide ranges and they just kind of, were just around foraging and would go far distances to forage. So yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, I don't think they were like, by any means like, house sparrows or passenger pigeons. But there seemed to be a fair amount of them around. They were pretty, if you went to the right areas, they were pretty easy to find.
Okay.
But yeah, I don't have a solid answer for you. I mean, and that's the hard thing about talking about an extinct species that wasn't really well studied. And a lot of what we know about it is from anecdotal observations or from, Audubon, who was not probably the most diligent of scientists. So a lot of, like I said, he was prone to exaggeration. So it's really hard to decipher a lot of this. Yeah.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
sorry, I don't have a better
I
answer.
mean, no, that's better than what I had, which was nothing. So
Yeah.
yeah, we got a question here. Jacob Drucker, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question in person?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. That was a great talk, Kevin. Nice to see you and hear it. I was just wondering if you have any other ideas of how to look back at records of other pathogens that could have been moving around the area in the late 1800s, and if there's anything in the poultry industry or the cage bird industry, which presumably were booming at the time and have records and records and records to pour through. But if you pour through those records, would you see other evidence of some sort of pathogen outbreak? And
Yeah, I mean, I've tried a bunch of different things. I even emailed the Council of Eggs. I forget what they're called, to see, like, I'm like, maybe I could get an idea if they had like a map of like per county how many eggs are being produced and how that changed over time. And if that was I could use that as a proxy for a number of chickens that they could have encountered. But the data in 1800s is just not great. It's sparse at best. And maybe the data exists somewhere in some old tome in the Smithsonian or something, but I tried everything I could think of. Like one of the other potential, one of the ideas that people have floated over the years is a potential source of their extinction is competition with honeybees for roosting sites, because honeybees like to use hollows in trees, which the Carolina parakeet would use for breeding and for roosting. And so some people have said, well, the honeybees drove them from their places where they would so I'm like, okay, maybe I could look at honeybee distribution and how that changed and see if there's any correlations between how the European honeybee like kind of overtook our continent. But the data just doesn't exist. I was considering at one point trying to figure out how to model, because there is an old Native American saying from the time that once you start seeing these honeybees, white people are about like a couple years behind. And I was like, well, how could I model that? Could I look at human population changes and kind of project, like 2 years or however long they said it was? And it just, I mean, once you start building on that many assumptions, I mean, modeling is imperfect as it is. and to model out something that's so shaky like that. I had to finish my dissertation. I could have spent a lifetime trying to figure this out. So it is possible that data is out there. I've made my data set freely available of the Carolina Parakeet distribution. I published a paper and made the data freely available. So hopefully someone else can take the mantle and figure it out. So maybe it's you, Jacob. You have my blessing if you want to go and have at it. I'll be happy to talk to you about it and tell you what I did, and maybe you have some better ideas or some different ideas. But I've spoken to so many different people. I'm trying to think of like, maybe there's a way to go back to the very few remaining Carolina parakeets that were preserved in alcohol as opposed to skinned. Maybe there's a way to take samples and find some DNA of, psittacosis or some other disease. But I don't think the technology is there yet. And there's not a lot. I can't remember how many are in spirits, but it's less than 10. So it may be one of these things we just never know. Yeah. Do we have any other questions?
Yeah. So one of the people dropped in the chat, they had to leave, but you kind of touched on it, but they were just asking if there's anything to that theory with honeybees sort of invading spaces.
Yeah. I mean, there is a paper that really looked at it and concluded it was unlikely. I mean, it may be in a localized level, maybe, but the bees and the birds prefer different size hollows. So they may have competed over some of them, but it probably wasn't enough to make a big dent in it. But again, when you're already reeling on the ropes, even a little gut punch is gonna, take, it's not helping. And another thing that hasn't been published, and I was talking to some other scientist years ago about the honeybee thing, and he had a really interesting point, is that he said it may not just be the competition, like direct competition for these places to breed. It may well be that people used to cut down these trees to get the honey. Honey hunters used to cut down these trees, and if there was hollows that were big enough for the bees, maybe there were a lot of hollows that the birds were using as well. So maybe that had something to do with it. But how do you quantify that? I think it would be impossible to know like where people cut down these trees. And I talked to a lot of entomologists that study bees to see if there was any kind of like, map that showed the kind of progression of honeybees across the US, and it just doesn't exist because people weren't collecting data like that back then as they do now. So yeah, that's the honeybee thing. I usually keep that in, but for time I had to cut that one out because I consider it the least likely.
There you go. Yeah. We got another question from Leslie DeCourcy. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question in person?
Yes. It was a great talk. I really am enjoying it.
Thank you.
So yeah, my question was, the time period really kind of overlaps the loss of passenger pigeons as well. And passenger pigeons in that 3 to 5 billion, individuals was a biomass that's just, it had to be a major shaper of environment. Is there any maybe correlation between the dropping of populations of passenger pigeons and their effects on habitat that may have also affected the Carolina parakeet?
I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that question. They're certainly, I mean, because if you look at, the passenger pigeon, the Carolina parakeet, Bachman's warbler, and the ivory-billed woodpecker, and the heath hen for that matter, all saw huge population drops around the same time. I mean, I think the science about the passenger pigeon is pretty solid, that we hunted them to death essentially. And I think the consensus now on the ivory-billed was that it was habitat loss, though I'm personally not sold on that. because there are very large intact areas of swampy areas that they liked, but just like the Carolina parakeet. Yeah, but the answer to that question is there may well be, and I don't know the answer to it.
Thank you.
I don't think anyone does.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Does this mean you're one of those people who thinks the ivory bill is still out there?
No, not at all. No, I don't think it's out there. Sorry. Yeah, I don't think it's out there anymore. Sadly, I think the modeling and yeah, I never bought that sighting back by John Fitzpatrick. I think it was pretty well debunked right afterwards. But that certainly didn't stop them from raising lots of money to go and keep looking for it. But yeah, I don't think they're around anymore. I mean, who knows? I mean, there's species that we think are gone and show up like 100 years later. But I don't think they're going to be one of them, sadly.
All right, looks like we got one more question in the chat right now from Elizabeth Richter.
Sure.
Elizabeth Richter, are you still here? Would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, so my question has to deal with Native American peoples and how they're involved or not involved in our understanding of our landscape and our environment. And so I was just wondering, you know, if any information was available from Native American people or culture to inform, you know, either your report or previous understandings. Like, was it sought out, or was it, you know, kind of a distinct separation? Because, you know, historically Native American populations were, you know, kind of set within their reservation areas and whatnot. And I'm just wondering, like, you know, I'm just thinking, like, as far as like future conservation efforts, like how that information could be helpful. And, you know, at the same time, like, you know, why was it not used in the past? So how do we incorporate the two? And so I'm just wondering, you know, if you have had any experience, you know, working with Native American culture or, you know, peoples or records, you know, whatever is available to inform decision making, and if that's helpful.
Yeah, the answer to that question is I read some sources on that come from Native peoples. And this is, you know, most of the information that was used in all of this research is from white people. And I think going forward, and I was thinking about this actually while I was getting ready for this talk, you know, I really think that going forward, that having access to that knowledge is really important. I think it's a huge missing piece, honestly. And it's, you know, and historically, you know, we've ignored that as an important data source. And I certainly did too, because I was trying to find stuff in books that were already written, but they were all written by white people. You know, and the sad thing is, I think that if I were in the position to continue this research, which I'm presently not, because my job has nothing to do with this, I would certainly push to reach out to the Native peoples that lived for thousands of years with this bird, and see what we can learn, you know, if you know, they wanted to share. Certainly, I don't think that we can force them to, but I would say I definitely think we could learn a lot about the species that we don't know in science right now by incorporating data from, or information from Native peoples. They certainly knew the bird way better than we ever will. And it is certainly a shame that nor I or other people before me sought out that information.
Well, like, we know Lewis and Clark did, you know, they're the most famous ones anyway, as far as like trying to navigate certain places. But, you know, other than that, it's just like, we think they had information, but we don't really know because we never really asked them.
Right.
I feel like that's the general consensus. And I wish we could change that, you know?
Yeah, no, I'm fully with you on that. I mean, there are some bits of information out there. There are Carolina parakeet parts of feathers and skeleton, I believe, that was found in Ontario. But it seems most likely that they were used by Native peoples as trading. And so like some people think that they were actually up in Ottawa. I mean, not in Ontario, but I mean, they may have been, but it's much more likely that they were used in by Native Americans. But you're right. We haven't asked and we don't know.
All right, I don't see any other questions in the chat. I just have one more broad question for you. Do we know anything about, I guess, any ecological vacuum that they left their extinction behind? You mentioned earlier the relationship with cocklebur, and as far as I know, they were one of the only, if not the only species that did actively eat cocklebur. So things like that. Do we know, since they're lost, if there were any kind of ecological effects as a result?
Yeah, I don't think there's any that are really, I mean, the other thing that they were really known for is they were one of the two North American species that can eat sycamore balls. The other is the evening grosbeak. But sycamores don't seem to be suffering. And yeah, so I don't know. I don't know if there's any kind of repercussions in our ecosystems of having them gone. I'm sure there are. There certainly are. But what they are, I don't think are easily quantified. I mean, they're not like beavers, right? Where, you take a beaver out, there's definitely very noticeable changes. So yeah, I don't think they're devastating. And another thing that we didn't talk about, which, I mean, if you have a few more minutes, I could talk about de-extinction, which used to be part of my talk, but I cut it out for time. Usually people ask me about that, like, oh, because there's people that are like very eager and have lots of money to do these type of things. I mean, frankly, I'd rather them spend money on species that are still around, because and people talk about the Carolina parakeet and say that they're one of the best candidates for de-extinction because they're parrots. We know how to captive raise parrots, right? But if we were good at captive breeding Carolina parakeets, we might still have them. They weren't the easiest bird to keep in captivity. Some species of parrots lend themselves to it, some don't. I don't think they were one that did. But the thing is, we still don't really know why they went extinct, despite everybody seeming to think they know. And we don't actually know that maybe today the type of habitat they need exists, but 20, 30 years from now, will it exist? And if it is disease, is that disease still out there? Like you could go and say, okay, well, I'm going to spend $50 million and bring in these birds that resemble Carolina parakeets. They're not purely Carolina parakeets because we use genes from sun conures, their closest relative, or something like that. And then we release them, they encounter a chicken, and suddenly no more Carolina parakeets. You just wasted $50 million. So I in generally am not huge. I mean, I don't think there's anybody in the world that would love to see living Carolina parakeets more than me right now. But I think there's just way better uses of the money. And like I said, parrots are incredibly at risk. And that money could go very far in helping save parrots that are endangered or threatened right now. So I guess I got ahead of that one because nobody asked, but I do like to talk about it because it's an interesting thing. And I think it's one of those things that just because we can do something doesn't necessarily mean we should. It's just like where you see all these billionaires racing each other to get out in space when they could probably use that money to fix the planet. So that's kind of how I feel about that. I don't think they're a terribly good candidate. Passenger pigeons, I think, are a way better candidate because we know why they went extinct. And if we just didn't shoot them, maybe they'd have a shot,
No, that's totally makes sense. And even if nobody asked about it, I'm sure it was on people's minds. It crosses everybody's minds at some point when talking about extinction.
Right.
But on that note, thank you, Kevin, so much for your time this evening. Really, really appreciate it. Thank you, everybody here, for joining us for this awesome presentation and your questions. This video, this program was recorded. We will be having it posted some point within the next few days here, fingers crossed. Once again, if you guys are not already members of COS, why the heck not? It supports amazing, super in-depth programs like this one for free, as well as helps support active conservation projects, because you know what? We do still have a lot of threatened and endangered species that are still with us today, some of which we successfully gave a second shot by preserving this nearby prairie, and others are still declining. And so it definitely falls to us, birders or otherwise, to try to keep what we have still on the planet. So on that note, thank you so much, Kevin, for joining us. Really appreciate your time and your expertise. Have a great night, everybody, and enjoy your weekend.
Thanks for having me. Bye, everybody.
Night, y'all.